Let's talk about Servo. Servo is a web engine started in 2012 by Mozilla as a research project. In the 8 years since, Servo has been a vehicle for three main things. Servo heavily influenced the Rust programming language, especially leading up to Rust 1.0 in 2015. Servo was also a great place to experiment with parallelism in web engines, which gave us things like work stealing in the style engine. Finally, Mozilla took those lessons they learned from Servo back to Firefox, so the DOM subsystem now runs on user space threads with cooperative scheduling. And several Rust components like encoding RS, stylo, and WebRender were integrated directly into Firefox. By mid-2020, this oxidation effort reached a point where over 12% of the Firefox codebase was written in Rust. And then the layoffs happened. By this point, the WhatWG encoding library, that is encoding RS, the CSS parser, the style engine, or stylo, and graphics renderer, or WebRender, were now part of Firefox, and for some of these, Mozilla Central is actually the upstream now. Servo also borrows its JavaScript engine from Firefox in the form of SpiderMonkey. But this whole time, Servo has been this more or less independent web engine, written almost entirely in Rust. It has parallelism in both style and layout. It was designed for modularity right from the beginning, and it was also designed to allow for embedding, although there's a fair bit of work still needed before that will become practical. What can we do with that? What new purposes can Servo bring to the table? With the help of the Linux Foundation, we've managed to secure some funding to start working on Servo again, and our initial focus is going to be embedded. Why embedded? Well, I think we can all agree that we need more web engine diversity, and that includes diversity in general purpose browser engines. But taking on Google, Apple, and Mozilla isn't something we can do overnight. Certainly not with the 5 or 6 people we have working on it full time right now. On the other hand, the embedded web engine space is even less diverse. There's WPE, which runs on WebKit, and CEF, which runs on Chromium, and those are pretty much your only major options. Embedded web engines also allow for use cases where the content is written by the same people who want to embed the engine, which means the content can sometimes be tailored to the features currently supported by the engine. At the end of the day, focusing on embedded means Servo can reach a useful state sooner than if it needed to render the full range of content that exists out there on the web. Now, let's take a look at some of the highlights in Servo's development since the start of this year. We've restarted the Technical Steering Committee, which now meets once a month to help the project run smoothly. One of the big efforts to come out of that is reconciling the two layout engines, that is Layout 2013 and Layout 2020, but more on that in a little bit. Alongside that, we've helped land 328 patches in the main repo alone, which already far exceeds the amount of patches that were landed in all of last year. This includes many improvements to builds and releases and making it easier to contribute to Servo, several big dependency updates. We've put a lot of work into reducing web platform test failures, and in particular, flaky tests. There's been some new feature work as well in Layout 2020, which is the newer of the two layout engines. And we're going to come back to these in a bit more detail soon, but keep an eye out for the non-Igalia contributors in bold. The Technical Steering Committee oversees pretty much everything Servo, including committers and other roles, the design and architecture of Servo, builds and releases, and outreach. We now meet monthly, and the exact dates and times are announced on Zulip. That said, you don't need to be on the committee to participate. Anyone can raise points to discuss on GitHub, and the minutes are published live on Zulip and later on GitHub as well. I mentioned earlier that Servo currently has two layout engines. One of them is currently known as Layout 2013, and it's still the default for now. There's also a newer layout engine designed to replace Layout 2013, which was still a work in progress when development stalled. This newer engine is known as Layout 2020, though I suppose, given the delays in switching to it, 2020 is a bit of a misnomer at this point. So, to be clear, layout in Servo covers everything between DOM and style and the display list, including what some engines, like Chromium, call paint. There are several differences between Layout 2013 and Layout 2020, but here are the most important ones. The main drawback of Layout 2020 at the moment is that it's not as complete as 2013 is. So, most importantly, it does not yet support floats, tables, or incremental layout. On the other hand, Layout 2020 uses opportunistic parallelism, which is an improvement over the eager parallelism of Layout 2013. You can think of this like opt-in parallelism versus opt-out parallelism. The approach that Layout 2013 used unfortunately made things like floats and margin collapsing a bit of a nightmare to implement and maintain. Perhaps surprisingly though, the performance of opportunistic parallelism is not generally worse than in Layout 2013. It's about the same actually, and in many cases the performance is better. Layout 2020 also splits the flow tree into separate box and fragment trees. This should improve the implementation of fragmentation and multi-column layout. Layout 2020 also generates a web render display list directly, rather than having to go through an intermediate representation like Layout 2013 does. And finally, Layout 2020 is more closely aligned with web platform specs in its naming and architecture, especially with CSS specs. We're hoping that this last difference will make Layout 2020 easier to contribute to as well. Based on these differences, we proposed a gradual transition to Layout 2020. This will involve a handful of steps, but the first two of these steps are already well underway. We're going to improve support for Layout 2020 in CI and releases, and we'll also start implementing some smaller features like text indent and vertical align, just to get a feel for what it's like to develop for Layout 2020. Eventually, we'll need to decide if we want to remove Layout 2013 and commit to the switch. And assuming we go ahead with the switch to Layout 2020, we'll hopefully be well placed to tackle the most complex features of CSS2, like floats. If you're interested in some of the details, check out our report, which I've linked in the slides. When we run the web platform tests, we now retry unexpected results to iron out random flakes. We also now have support for marking tests as having multiple acceptable expectations, such as a test that can either pass or fail, or a test that could pass or time out. My colleague Martin has fixed a bunch of sources of flakiness in Servo, in particular in scrolling, hit testing, and animations. I've helped land a long-standing change that adds named access on the window object to Servo. This is a web platform feature that hundreds of tests rely on that allows you to look up elements by their ID implicitly as properties on the window object. And we're also working on support for the font loading API, which will help with a lot of tests that rely on web fonts. In our builds and releases, we now have comments on our pull requests after each build that summarize the test results. We've also built a new intermittence dashboard, which will help us analyze the causes of flaky tests. We've made several improvements to builds in forks and web platform test upstreaming. Sagudev has also contributed a new mark try command, and also support for SCCache on Linux and macOS, which should improve CI times on those platforms significantly. We've helped land a whole bunch of dependency updates, most notably in the TrueType, Winit, and Euclid crates, in our Python and Rust tooling, in webidl.py, as well as several crate dedupes, which should make the build faster and smaller. We're also working on a web render upgrade. In Layout 2020, we've added support for the new layout engine to Mark, and partial support to CI. We've added support for frames, the min and max width properties, and the min and max height properties. We've also added support for text indent, outline, and outline offset, and we've even made some improvements to text decoration. Coming up in Layout 2020, we will probably take a look at position sticky, the vertical align and whitespace properties, counters for ordered lists, and eventually the boss fight of CSS2, floats. There are a couple of ways you can see Servo's web API support. One of them is wpt.fyi, which actually has data for Servo, it's just not shown by default. To fix that, click Edit, Add Product, then choose Servo and click Submit. FYI is great for drilling down from specs to directories to tests and subtests, but it's not so great for tracking progress over time, though that is still possible. Note that the data here is currently for Layout 2013 only, but we're going to add Layout 2020 soon. We've also created our own Web Platform Tests dashboard. This page tracks our pass rate over time, has nightly data for both Layout 2013 and 2020, and it even has filters for our various focus areas, including key sections of CSS2, the CSS object model, and the CSS position module. To understand how Layout 2020 currently compares to Layout 2013, let's take a look at ACID 1 and ACID 2. These tests already pass in Layout 2013, but don't yet pass in Layout 2020, and looking at the results may help us understand where we're at with the feature set. So ACID 1 is more or less correct, with the exception of a complete lack of float support. And ACID 1 relies on floats heavily, so all of the boxes are stacked on top of each other. As for ACID 2, well, the results are a bit more gnarly, but having an understanding of what isn't yet implemented in Layout 2020 means that the result is actually quite understandable. For one, there's no support for floats yet, there's no support for whitespace other than normal, or vertical align values other than top. The only list styles supported are inside and either disk or none, and tables are unsupported, so the unordered list and list item elements can't have their display values set to table or table cell. There's no support for object tags in 2020 yet, and there's some keywords in the background shorthand that are not yet supported. So if we applied those styles for things that are not yet supported to the ACID test and loaded it up in, say, Firefox, we'd get basically the same result as we do with the real test in Layout 2020. The ACID tests aren't everything though, and there's still a lot that you can build that runs on the features supported by Layout 2020 today. One of Servo's classic demos is the Mosaic Gallery, which stresses our parallel style system by using elements with CSS transitions as pixels. A new demo we're especially proud of is the Twiggle Tunnel, which relies on our fairly robust WebGL support. And to top it all off, these slides that you're looking at in this talk are rendered entirely in Layout 2020 as it stands today. If you'd like to get involved with Servo, check out our Hacking Quick Start Guide, join the Zulip if you have any questions, hack on Layout if you dare, but maybe after we switch to Layout 2020. Definitely hack on other parts of Servo as well though, especially the DOM, CSS object model, navigation, iframes, and DevTools. Did you know that Servo has support for the Firefox DevTools protocol? Unfortunately, it has bit-rotted to the point where it no longer works, but if you can fix that, we would much appreciate it. Join us and make some cool demos that show off Servo's capabilities on Servo experiments, and be sure to report any bugs you find on GitHub. You can find these slides at go.daz.cat/JTHHA. Thanks a lot.
we have Delan joining us live. Let's see if we can do it. Oh, yeah. Hey. So do we have questions? Hi, Delan. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay,
Am I coming?
cool. Questions, anyone? Okay, no worries. Then I have questions for you. So you mentioned layout 2013 and layout 2020, and we can also see lots of messages regarding that on metrics. So what is the status of transition now?
Transitions, sorry?
What is the status of layout 2020 transition now?
Oh, I'll share my screen actually, because a couple of things have happened since I wrote that talk. The two big ones are, is my screen coming through okay?
Yeah.
Sweet. So the two big ones that have happened since I wrote the talk are that at the last TSC meeting, which was about a week ago, we decided to switch the default layout engine to layout 2020. We haven't actually done that yet, but that's going to mean that when you compile it from source, it's going to default to layout 2020, and also the releases that you download from the Servo website will start using layout 2020 soon. And the other thing that's happened recently is that we've started working on floats now. And we've landed an initial patch that like partially implements floats. But yeah.
Cool, thanks. We have a question on metrics. How far is a pure servo browser for daily end users usage on desktop away?
It's probably a while. There are a few things that are missing that before you could use Servo as a daily driver. One is that there's no real UI to it, which you'll probably see soon. If you tried Servo now, there's no like address bar or anything like that. Context menus, input is kind of limited. But the bigger problem is that using Servo as a general purpose browser won't work for a lot of modern content that relies on stuff beyond CSS2. The JavaScript's okay, but it'll be a while before you can use Servo as a sort of general purpose like daily driver.
Nice, cool. As you were talking, you mentioned that there is no UI on Servo right now. So how did you run the Servo experiments?
Yeah, so if you want to use layout 2020, you can't use the pre-built versions of the Servo website yet, although we'll be switching that over soon. So for layout 2020, I'm going to build from source. It's like a thing in the way. So build it. Should already be built. And demo.servo.org. So yeah, pass in demo.servo.org, and this should be wrapping. I'm not sure why that isn't wrapping. There we go. So you can pick a demo, and oops, sorry. And at the moment, if you want to go back, you'll have to hold Alt or Option and press the left arrow, because there is no like UI yet. We should probably like add some links, like a button in the corner or something. But yeah.
Cool, cool, very cool. Thank you. One last question from my side. You mentioned that there wasn't any support to float when you recorded this presentation. So how did you get the images to float?
Yeah, so I, for most of them, I I used inline block, aligned everything to the top, and just had like widths. For one of them where the text appears to wrap around the image, where is it? I've just used like absolute positioning and had it overlap. There's actually like a bunch of interesting workarounds. Like if you pull up the slides, you'll find a bunch of interesting things I had to do to to make it work well in Servo. But yeah.
Cool, thank you. We have one more question on metrics. How do you see the future of Gecko and Servo?
I think I can't really speak for Gecko, but I think the relationship between Gecko and Servo will continue as it has now. Like there are some major components of Servo that are shared with Gecko, and I don't really see that changing. But like on the Gecko side of things, I can't really speak for that. You'll have to ask some Mozilla folks.
Do we have some Mozilla folks here who would like to answer, maybe? Oh, yeah, Emilio.
Yeah, I mean, I'm all for not duplicating work. So like, especially as Servo matures and more people start like, fixing bugs and stuff, it would be great to be able to both like share our fixes so you don't have to implement like, the style engine, like all the new style engine features that we've implemented since 2020, and vice versa as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. All right, let me check again, Matrix, if we have any questions. Okay, no questions. Any questions from here? Okay, no questions. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you very much.
Thanks.